And then Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the two tables of the testimony were in his hand. By the tables was written on both their sides, on one side and on the other were they written. In verse number 15, and I brought these over here to show you, because oftentimes when we see the tables of stone, we don't realize that in verse number 15, and Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the two tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both their sides. Now, these are stones that we have made, and they have the commandments written on both sides. The name of Jehovah is at least 8 times, I believe it's 9 times, on these tables of stones, which was written on both sides. Now, it's important because many people don't know this. You would think they would know this, but most of the 10 commandments we see are written on one side. But here we see them in the language that they were given in, written on both sides. And the tables were the work of Elohim, and the writing was the writing of Elohim, graven upon the tables. Thank you, gentlemen. Now, what we see is Moses is up in the mountain for 40 days. For 40 days. He comes down because Jehovah, he would have probably been up there longer, but Jehovah says, go, get down. So he leaves. He comes down, and as you read in Exodus 32, you see what he does when he comes down. Now, it's important because now, let's say if we're at 50 days, here's another 40 days, he comes down with the commands, and the people still don't receive them because he throws them down and breaks them. So here it is, the Father is trying to give the commands, he's trying to give the Torah, but they still haven't received them. Now Moses has to go up another 40 days. You see. And I want to show you how traditions really can latch on to us. And next thing you know, we're saying things that we don't fully grasp or understand. Now, let's say that a person makes the argument that on Pentecost, Feast of Weeks, that Jehovah actually gave them the commands, which he did speak. The question is that if they gave them or did they receive them? Because the argument is that on Shavuot, they received the Torah. And so the tradition is that on Shavuot, they received the Torah. How many of you are familiar with that tradition? And you've shared it. How many of you shared it? Be honest. My hands up. And I'm thinking as I'm driving in my truck and the Father is showing me, he says, you know, you really need to help people to understand the dangers of traditions and making distinction between truth and traditions so that people will stand and present truth. And it's nothing wrong with saying, you know, it is believed by many that the Torah was given on the Feast of Weeks. But what you're doing is that you're offering a disclaimer. You're saying it is believed by many, and there are many who do believe it. But the truth of the matter is that even if Jehovah did on that particular day, which we've counted, and there seems to be some discrepancies there, that Jehovah shouted it, but they didn't receive it. Moses goes up for another 40 days and comes down. They still don't receive it. Moses goes back up. And what's interesting is that the idea of Feast of Weeks don't even show up until the second time Moses goes up in the mountain. So during that entire time that Moses is up the first time, the word, the Feast of Weeks don't even come up. It doesn't appear until Exodus 34. That's the first time the term Feast of Weeks, or the people have an idea that now they have to celebrate the Feast of Weeks. And the question is, what would it be celebrating? Could it be just as every act of Jehovah concerning these feasts required something of the people? They had to put the blood on the doorposts. Act of obedience. They had to leave in haste. He said, move. Act of obedience. Is it possible that there are people who would want us to associate a particular day with something good than with what really is happening, which is a identifying of the rejection of Jehovah's commands? I just find it interesting that it doesn't show up until Exodus 34, and it doesn't specifically say this commemorates. Because if in fact Exodus 20 is when Jehovah shouted down the commands, the people rejected it. Jehovah was going to destroy them. I'm going to tell you something about tradition. Tradition seems to always bring out the good of the story. It always seems to highlight and paint a picture of beauty and glory and the remembrance of good times. But Jehovah wanted them to remember on Passover, I killed some people. I killed a whole bunch of people, remember? That's the day I killed all the firstborn. And just remember now, on unleavened bread, I didn't allow you to get comfortable because you had to move in haste and you had to eat something that you were not comfortable with because your bread didn't have a chance to rise. Okay. And remember, that's the day that I brought you out of the land. And I made you to eat unleavened bread. Tabernacle, remember I made you to dwell in booths. But in eating unleavened bread and the manna, when it's associated, we find that bread seems to indicate, when he talks about it, that I wanted to show you something. I suffered you. I suffered you to hunger, that you remember that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Jehovah. You see, in every one of these, Jehovah is reminding the people of what he did. This is not something that has a wonderful reminder of, because even if Jehovah shouted down, let me tell you something. If I'm going to remember the history, if I'm going to remember the history accurately, can I remember accurately being at the foot of the mountain, receiving the Torah in the time frame of the 50 days, and not remember the fact that my ancestors was worshiping an idol in the presence of Jehovah? When he decides that he's going to kill them and start over. That's not a beautiful tradition. Because it reminds me that we were looking face to face at death. The same thing that befell the Egyptians we were face to face with, because our ancestors was in the presence of the Almighty worshiping golden calves and idols in his presence when they had been instructed not to do that. That was the second commandment. You shall put no other Elohim before my face. And that's exactly what they did on that day. You see, here's what I believe that Jehovah is trying to communicate to all of us. Number one, not only do he has the power to sustain you, to provide for you, to protect you, to make his power available to you, he also has the power to condemn, to destroy. And that is not for us. But it will be our lot if we forget. If we forget that he is the one who is our deliverer. He is the one who's given us his commands. He is the one that he said, don't put anything before me, nothing. Don't put anything in heaven above. That's anything that flies, anything in the heavens, the stars, the moons. You don't bow down and worship the moon. You don't worship stars. You don't worship planets. You don't get into, the days of Aquarius. You don't seek the stars for your future. You don't worship anything in the earth, in the water below the shoreline, in the waters. You don't worship fish. You don't worship crabs. You don't worship lobsters and shrimp and eels and all of that stuff. And then you don't worship anything in the earth. Nothing that creeps, nothing that crawls around, nothing that walks. I'm going to tell you something, folks. I know parents who worship their children. When their children are gone, their life is over. They have no more life. Marriages go in separate direction because the marriage life surrounds the bringing up of the children. And when the children is gone, there's nothing left. They've lost the relationship. They don't know how to get along. They've grown apart. And the father's saying, don't let your children come between the one that you marry. I did a whole series on marriage God's way. You see, that you don't make a covenant with your children. You make a covenant with your husband and with your wife. It is to them that you have covenant till death do you part, not to your children. So anybody who put their children in front of their marriage, you're setting yourself up for a divorce. It is the responsibility of husband and wife to raise their child, not the responsibility of mom or the responsibility of dad. Mom and dad is supposed to be one. And the administering of discipline is to come from a joint source so that the child can't play the mother against the father or the father against the mother. And now you have a conversation with your child and you end up fighting with your wife. Because the child is being protected by the mother. And you mothers, you better watch it. Because you'll let them hard-headed jokers come between you and your mate, and then now, next thing you know, they gone and he gone. So, Jehovah says you don't let nothing come between him. And once you got that relationship with him right, all of these relationships will get on the right page. If that relationship is not right, these relationships will not be right. I'm telling you, if this relationship is not right, these relationships, and what I mean by these, your parents' relationships, your spouse's relationships, your children's relationships, your business relationships, your financial relationships, your employment relationships, none of your relationships will be right if your relationship with him is not in the right place. And that's what I believe the Almighty is trying to communicate. Remember, I brought you all out, but as soon as I brought you into my face, where I now am coming down to meet with you, you're at the foot of my mountain. While you're at the foot of my mountain, you got the nerve to build a golden calf when I told you, do not put any other Elohim before my face? I will kill you. Don't kill him, God. And those same hard-headed, stiff-necked individuals prevented Moses from fulfilling his destiny because he got between the Almighty and the people. You see, people will put their minister between them and their Elohim. It is a mistake for a minister to allow people to put them between him and them. Because the same fate that befell Moses will befell them. Now, God didn't really say that. Well, preacher, what about the Sabbath? Well, you don't have to do it. Jesus paid the price. He nailed it to the cross. He did, Reverend? Yes, he did. Thank you, Reverend. Whew, I was worried there for a minute. So people put their minister between him and them. And for you future ministers, I'm telling you now, you work for him, not for them. You work for him, not for them. If you work for them, claiming you work for him, you're going to end up with them, not him. Can it get any plainer than that? So, Feast of Weeks, I believe, commemorates the time where the people put other Elohims before the Almighty, based on what we present. But what I believe is not relevant to you, it's relevant to me only. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we cannot say with any assurity from a scriptural perspective that Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. This program is made possible through financial contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.